In the mud-soaked streets of the most dangerous town in the American West, a feeling of unease was beginning to settle, a quiet dread that had nothing to do with the usual threats of gold theft or gunfights. The Deadwood of 1877 was a wound carved into the Black Hills, a place that bled gold and attracted every variety of desperado, dreamer, and damned soul the frontier could produce. Crammed into a narrow gulch where pine-covered slopes pressed close, the settlement sprawled in defiance of common sense, a maze of canvas tents, hastily built wooden structures, and mud streets that turned to rivers with every rain. Murder was commonplace enough that the town's cemetery, Mount Moriah, filled rapidly with markers bearing little more than nicknames. Saloons outnumbered legitimate businesses 3-1, and vice was the town's primary industry. And yet, for all its chaos, Deadwood possessed a strange kind of order, an unspoken code where thieves faced swift justice from miners' courts. But in a place where people vanished into the wilderness or moved on without a word, a missing child might prompt a moment of concern, but sustained investigation was a luxury the town could rarely afford. It was this specific vulnerability that allowed an unimaginable horror to take root in the heart of Main Street, a horror that began a year earlier with the arrival of a quiet, unremarkable boy. Young Thomas Canfield arrived in late March of 1876, traveling in the wagon of a freight hauler who'd found the boy wandering alone on the trail from Cheyenne. The boy, just 10 years old, claimed his father, a prospector, had died in a mineshaft collapse. The hauler, a practical man named Silas Vaughn, had neither the time nor the inclination to verify the story. Deadwood was full of orphans. One more would scarcely be noticed. Thomas appeared unremarkable, small for his age, with dark hair and a thin, angular face that seemed too old for his years. But his eyes, a peculiar pale gray, held a stillness that some found unsettling, a quality that seemed to look through rather than at whatever they fixed upon. Vaughn deposited the boy at the Deadwood Merchants Association, where a severe widow named Constance Pritchard ran an informal orphan placement service. She took one look at Thomas and sighed with the weariness of someone who had processed too many displaced children in too short a time. "Can you work?" she asked, her tone making it clear that the only acceptable answer was yes. "I can work," Thomas replied, his voice flat. "Any trade skills? Your father teach you anything useful?" "He taught me how things come apart," Thomas said, a strange phrasing that Constance attributed to grief. "How they fit together inside." She nodded, and remembering that Garrett Hollis, the butcher, needed help, she brought the boy to his shop on Main Street. Hollis was a man of substantial physical presence, broad-shouldered and thick-armed from decades of wielding cleavers. He looked up from the pig carcass he was working on, noted the steady way the child watched his hands, and shrugged his acceptance. "Boy's got to earn his keep," Hollis said. "Room in the back, meals twice daily, and $2 a week once he's learned the work. If he can't stomach the blood, he's gone." Thomas stepped closer, his pale eyes fixed on where the knife had exposed the architecture of bone and muscle. "I can stomach it," he said quietly. That night, sleeping on a cot surrounded by the smell of sawdust and old blood, Thomas felt something that in another child might have been anticipation, but in him registered as simple recognition of opportunity. Deadwood was a place where things came apart constantly. And here, in this shop filled with sharp instruments and dark corners, he would have the chance to learn so much more. The education of Thomas Canfield began in earnest. Hollis, an efficient teacher, explained the secrets of his trade. "Most folks just hack away," he explained, not looking up from a deer carcass. "But if you understand how an animal is put together, you can take it apart clean, waste nothing. See here, this connective tissue. You cut along it, not through it." Thomas watched with absolute focus, his pale eyes tracking every movement of the blade. His attention was so complete that Hollis found it almost unnerving. Most boys fidgeted or looked away. This child stood motionless. "Muscle fibers run in directions," Hollis continued. "And the organs, each one has its place, its purpose. Heart here, lungs there, liver tucked up under the ribs. Same design in every creature, just different sizes." "Even in people?" Thomas asked, his tone merely curious. Hollis paused, his knife hovering. "I suppose so," he said slowly. though that's not knowledge I've had occasion to use. Over the following weeks, Thomas proved an exceptionally quick study, his small hands wielding the knives with surprising precision. But there were moments that gave the butcher pause. The way Thomas would stand over a carcass long after the work was done, studying it with that peculiar intensity. The questions he asked, always phrased neutrally, but carrying unsettling implications. How long did different organs take to stop functioning? What happened when major blood vessels were severed? Morbid curiosity, Hollis told himself, attributing it to the boy's recent loss. He didn't know that Thomas had discovered his other trade, the secret disposal of bodies for Deadwood's criminal element. One night, through a crack in the wall, Thomas watched Hollis accept a canvas-wrapped burden from two men, carry it to the cold room, and later noticed the unusual cleanliness of certain tools. The next night, Thomas picked the lock. Among the hanging sides of beef, he found what remained. The proportions were wrong for any animal. The bone structure was too familiar. This discovery did not horrify Thomas. Instead, it illuminated possibilities. If Hollis could dispose of human remains this way, processing them into anonymity, then the method itself was proven. The butcher had demonstrated that in Deadwood's chaos, a body could simply cease to exist. All he lacked was a subject. It came on a Friday evening in mid-June. A scrappy 12-year-old named Sam, who survived by running errands, approached the shop just as Thomas was closing up, hoping for a few coins. "Mr. Hollis is at the gem," Thomas said. "Won't be back for hours." Sam's face fell. "I could use help though," Thomas offered, his voice carefully neutral. "Moving some heavy things in the cold room. I can pay you $1. $1 was generous. Hunger made a compelling argument, and Sam nodded. Thomas led him through the quiet shop. Inside the cold room, meat hung from hooks in the shadows. "What needs moving?" Sam asked. Thomas had already positioned his tools, the same knives he used for his daily work, cleaned and laid out. "I need to show you something first," he said, and his hand moved with the speed of long practice. When it was over, Thomas stood in the cold room, feeling neither remorse nor satisfaction, only the cool sense of having completed a successful experiment. Over the next 3 nights, he reduced Sam's remains to anonymous components. Sam's disappearance caused barely a ripple. Thomas returned to his routine, waiting for the next opportunity. Over the next year, he carefully selected his subjects. Margaret, a girl of 9 who slept in an alley. Joseph, a 10-year-old who worked at the stamp mill. Each disappearance was a quiet tragedy, noted by Constance Pritchard in her ledger, a growing unease she couldn't quite justify. 3 children gone since summer, she mentioned one day to Hollis. "It troubles me." That evening, Hollis watched Thomas work, a creeping sense of wrongness he couldn't shake. "Thomas," he said slowly, "you remember that boy Sam?" Thomas looked up, his pale eyes meeting Hollis's with perfect neutrality. "I remember him. He came by looking for work. I told him to come back. I never saw him again." The answer was delivered with such calm certainty that Hollis felt foolish for his suspicions. What Thomas didn't know was that a new man had arrived in Deadwood, an agent sent by the territorial governor to bring order to the lawless town. Robert Becker was not what one might expect of a Pinkerton agent. At 42, he was slight of build with a scholar's stoop and wire-rimmed spectacles that gave him the appearance of a clerk. This appearance was precisely what made him effective. People overlooked him. He began his work with patient observation, and his investigation into gold theft soon led him to whispers about Garrett Hollis's nocturnal disposal services. Intrigued, Becker began watching the butcher shop, and he took note of the thin 12-year-old with unsettling pale eyes who worked there. A week after another child, Daniel, disappeared, Becker spoke with Constance Pritchard. 5 children in 11 months, she said, her voice trembling. It's as if someone knows precisely which children will be missed least. Becker's investigation revealed that 3 of the 5 had last been seen near the butcher shop. He entered the shop as a customer, observing Thomas's remarkable skill with the knives. "Your apprentice is quite skilled," Becker observed casually to Hollis. "Best hand I've seen," Hollis said with pride. "Orphaned boy." Father died in a mine collapse. Becker's mind worked rapidly. The boy had arrived in late March 1876. The first disappearance had been in June. He investigated the mine collapse and discovered what an expert confirmed. Certain support timbers showed signs of deliberate weakening. This was no accident, the engineer said. A boy who had possibly murdered his own father, who had then positioned himself in a trade that provided the tools and knowledge for efficient disposal of bodies. The theory strained credibility, yet the evidence continued to accumulate. The climax arrived on a moonless night in mid-June. Becker observed another late-night transaction at the shop, a canvas-wrapped burden, a transfer of money. The next morning, he arrived with a warrant and the newly appointed magistrate, Harrison Engel. The search of the cold room revealed exactly what Becker expected: partial human remains. Hollis, faced with the evidence, confessed immediately to the disposal business. But as a deputy documented the scene, he noticed anomalies. Among the recent remains were older fragments, their state of processing suggesting a different hand, one that worked with a careful precision that took time to explore anatomy. "Mr. Becker," the deputy called, his voice tight. "You should see this." The cuts were not the rough work of a criminal disposal. They were methodical, almost surgical. Becker examined the evidence, his theory solidifying into terrible certainty. "Mr. Hollis," he said slowly, this is different from your usual method." Hollis leaned closer, and his face drained of color as understanding dawned. The technique was familiar because he had taught it. The precision, the careful separation of muscle and bone. This was butchering technique applied with a skill level he recognized. "Thomas," Hollis whispered, the name escaping him like a death rattle. Becker turned to where Thomas stood, watching the proceedings with that characteristic stillness, his face showing no fear or guilt, only a calm assessment. "Thomas Canfield," Becker said formally, "I have questions regarding your activities in this establishment and your possible connection to the disappearances of several children." For a long moment, Thomas simply looked at Becker. Then, in a voice utterly devoid of inflection, he said, "I want to speak with you alone." In the temporary examination room, Becker sat across from the boy who had been waiting for hours without showing any distress. "You said you wanted to speak with me," Becker began. "You're different," Thomas said. "You see patterns. You understand method." "I understand evidence," Becker replied, "and the evidence suggests you've done terrible things." "Define terrible," Thomas said, his tone genuinely curious. "I've observed that people use that word differently. Mr. Hollis disposed of murdered bodies, yet you seem to consider him less terrible than me. Why?" Becker felt a chill. "Hollis facilitated crimes. You, if the evidence is correct, you killed children. Is there a difference?" Thomas tilted his head. "The people Hollis disposed of were alive once. I simply wanted to understand how things worked. The children I chose were going to suffer anyway. Deadwood kills children constantly. I simply made their deaths useful." The casual monstrousness of the statement struck Becker like a physical blow. "Useful how?" he asked, dreading the answer. "I learned anatomy," Thomas explained patiently. "Mr. Hollis taught me about animal bodies, but I knew the real understanding required human subjects. Each subject taught me something new." "And your father?" Becker asked. A flicker of something crossed the boy's eyes. "My father was necessary. He hurt me regularly, and I studied each injury. When I had learned enough, I applied that learning. The mine collapse was merely the method." The confession, if it could be called that, was a cascade of chillingly logical statements. Thomas wasn't evil. He was empty, a being born without the capacity for empathy. The interrogation was cut short when Garrett Hollis burst in, his face flushed with whiskey and rage, a revolver in his hand. "You monster!" he snarled at Thomas. "You made me part of your evil." Thomas looked at the butcher with mild interest. "You were already part of evil, Mr. Hollis. The only difference is that some of those bodies were mine." The cold logic enraged Hollis further. His hand shook as he raised the revolver, but before he could fire, a deputy struck him down from behind. In the ensuing chaos, Thomas remained perfectly still. When his eyes met Becker's, the investigator saw something that chilled him more than anything else: disappointment. Thomas had been curious to see what death by shooting would be like, and the interruption had denied him even that final observation. The trial was a formality. Becker laid out the evidence. Constance Pritchard testified through tears. Garrett Hollis spoke of the boy's unsettling curiosity. But it was Thomas himself who sealed his fate, insisting on testifying against his lawyer's advice. On the stand, his answers to the prosecutor were delivered with the same flat, precise voice. "Do you understand that the children you killed experienced fear and pain?" the prosecutor asked. "I understand that they exhibited physical responses consistent with those states," Thomas replied. "Whether their subjective experience matched what others call fear and pain, I cannot say." "Do you feel any remorse?" "Remorse is an emotional response to perceived wrongdoing. I don't experience such responses. I can recognize that my actions violated social and legal norms. But that recognition is intellectual, not emotional. The knowledge I gained was valuable to me." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict: guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. Magistrate Engel, his voice heavy, acknowledged the unprecedented nature of executing a child, but concluded that Thomas's complete lack of remorse and the danger he posed left no alternative. As guards led him away, Thomas turned to Becker. "Thank you for seeing clearly," he said, his voice carrying through the din. "Most people can't." On August 15, 1877, a scaffold stood in the center of Deadwood. A crowd gathered, torn between morbid curiosity and moral horror. Thomas was led from the jail, his demeanor unchanged. He climbed the steps without hesitation. When offered a chance for final words, he accepted. His voice carried in the hushed stillness. "I understand why you're doing this," he said conversationally. "Society requires shared moral codes to function, and I violated those codes. That's logical." He paused. "I'm curious whether any of you have wondered if there are others like me, people born without your emotional framework who have simply learned to hide it better than I did. It's statistically probable. Something to think about." A dark wave of unease rippled through the crowd. As the noose was placed around his neck, the hangman checked the knot, the minister said a final prayer, and the trap dropped. The snap of a breaking neck echoed in the stunned silence. In the aftermath, Deadwood tried to return to normal, but the case left a permanent scar. Constance Pritchard established a formal system to protect orphaned children, ensuring they would never be so vulnerable again. The 5 murdered children were memorialized with a small marker in Mount Moriah Cemetery, their names finally recorded, their existence finally honored. Thomas Canfield was buried in an unmarked grave, but the questions he raised in his final moments lingered. His case, when finally studied decades later, became a chilling reference point for understanding that the most terrifying monsters are not born of circumstance, but can be present from the very beginning, hiding behind a human face. What do you think of this story? Does Thomas's suggestion about others like him hiding in plain sight disturb you as much as it disturbed those who heard it in 1877? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this historical mystery as chilling as we did, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the darkest corners of human history. Until then, remember that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones that look the most human.